Now this morning, as I say, welcome to Wrestlers, where we apply God's Word to God's world. And today we have a speaker who has been doing that for his life in various ways, in very interesting ways in leadership in various places. And I want to share his biography a little bit with you and then turn it over. Richard Cizik is our speaker today. And he's currently the president of the new Evangelical Partnership for the Common Good. He has recently been appointed this president of this newly formed new Evangelical Partnership for the Common Good, a faith-based nonprofit that seeks to offer a Christian public witness for the sake of the gospel and the common good. He also currently serves as an Open Society Fellow and a Senior Fellow at the UN Foundation. Previously, he served for 10 years as Vice President for Governmental Affairs of the National Association of Evangelicals. In 1996, he served as a professional staff to the Religious Leaders Delegation to the People's Republic of China at the invitation of President Clinton. And Reverend Cizik was instrumental in creation of the Evangelical Climate Initiative introduced in 2006. And in 2008, he was named to Time Magazine's list of the Time 100 for collaborative efforts to bring science and religion into conversation. Do you remember that story where he was identified as being one of the 100 most influential thought leaders in the country? He's the author of The High Cost of Indifference and a contributor to On Christian Freedom, in the Dictionary of Christianity in America by InterVarsity, and the landmark document for the Health of the Nation, an Evangelical Call to Civic Engagement. He received a BA in Political Science from Whitworth College and an MA in Public Affairs from GW, University School of Public and International Affairs, and a Master of Divinity from Denver Seminary. He also studied overseas at the National Political Science University and the Taipei Language Institute, both in Taipei, Taiwan. Postgraduate research awards include a Scottish Rite Graduate Fellowship to George Washington University and a Rotary International Graduate Fellowship to the Republic of China. So, and he's still busy adding to this bio. That this publication just came out this last week, sponsored by the Chicago Council of Global Affairs. It's called Engaging Religious Communities Abroad, a New Imperative for U.S. Foreign Policy, report of the Task Force on Religion and the Making of U.S. Foreign Policy. So, Richard, come on up here and share with us some of the things you've been doing. Thank you for coming here.
Thank you very much, Paul and Kathy, who are old friends. So thank you for inviting me back. I have been here once before. Can't remember how long ago. Maybe, well, I won't say how many years. But it's a delight to be here. And to be among old friends. I saw John Marge, John particularly, I don't know, it's been maybe 20 plus years. Is that right, John?
Probably.
It's been way too long. But anyway, it's a
really old friend.
Really? Yes, well, our kids have grown old and we're getting younger every year, right? Such a delight to be here at this class, which is so well known around Washington for a place for people who want to share new ideas, and frankly, that's what I'm doing. I think it was Marge, or maybe it was Kathy, who said, well, you've had a tough year. Well, in a certain sense, I am remaking myself in that I had worked for one employer for 28 years. Now, when I was at Whitworth College, we had a futurist by the name, who was the president at the time, and he said that you will have at least 6 different careers. And I thought, wow, that's really hard. I should be prepared for that. Well, I ended up, after having come back from Asia and going to seminary and the rest, while there, in Taiwan, by the way, I met 2 people, Billy Graham and Norman Vincent Peale. And Graham held a crusade, and we sat in the rain and took kids to the crusade and all the rest. And the other person I met at a Rotary Club meeting in downtown Taipei, where he spoke. And if you know these Rotarians, they pay for you to go overseas and do these things. And I was one of them, and I had to give a speech, 8 minutes in Mandarin at the downtown club. Now, that's awful. Can you imagine having to do that in a language? Well, even in spite of my language, I got up and did it. But I tell the story because it had an impact on me. Not so much Graham, who I actually did meet while I was there, but Norman Vincent Peale, the mainline Protestant, who said to me, well, young man, what are you going to do with your life? And I said, well, Dr. Peale, I was planning on going into China when it opens up. Mao in 1974 was still alive. And you couldn't get into the mainland of China if you had a visa stamp type A. So I said, when it opens up, Mao dies, it will happen, I intend to potentially go to into the Foreign Service in China. And he said, well, well, what else are you thinking about? I said, well, I was thinking about doing that until I got some seminary classes. And I had, on my way over there, met George Eldon Ladd. Do you know Ladd's name? The Kingdom of the Future, a great theological influence at Fuller Seminary. And I also met Ralph Winter, that missiologist who just died at something like 90 years of age. In any case, I said I'd met both of them, and I was thinking of going to seminary. And he said something I'll never forget. He said, well, God can use a few good diplomats. So I took that as a charge. And but instead of having 6 different jobs, I guess I start that now. I spent 28 years at one. So in 1980, I went to work for the Association of Evangelicals here in Washington. And I actually spent 28, the last of those, 10 years as the VP for Governmental Affairs. And it was in those years that I met John, who constantly challenged me in so many ways. And so for those of you who think about your kids, I think that about mine, 16 and 19, I wonder, does it do any good? Sometimes the professor, the father, another factor, does in fact change people. They do change. And essentially my story is how I changed. And I changed in so many ways that when I gave an interview to Terry Gross at Fresh Air in December of 2008, I gave too much fresh air. Way too much. And I told her, well, first of all, she started out by saying, who did you vote for?
All right.
And I said, now just wait a second. First of all, you do the interview at the Christian Science Monitor headquarters downtown, and she's just a picture in front of you, even though she's in Philadelphia. So you look at this photo. I said, now just wait a minute. Why don't we start this over? Let me think about that. So she says, well, how long do you want? I said, well, give me 30 seconds at least. So I thought about it 30 seconds, and then I plowed ahead, and of course I plowed way too far by saying that I had voted in the Virginia primary for Obama. I said, it doesn't matter who I voted for in the general election because I can represent evangelicals who voted for either side. Well, that was bad enough, but then I said I had a change of mind on government funding of contraception, family planning, these issues, because I believe in an abortion reduction strategy, and I believe in Obama's abortion reduction strategies. And I'm pro-life, and I voted for the man, I said, not because of those positions on gay rights and abortion, but in spite of them, I voted for him, Obama. So I traversed, you see, the Democratic line, I traversed the abortion line, and then if that wasn't bad enough, then she said, well, speaking of that issue of gay marriage and the rest, what about that? I said, well, you know, younger evangelicals, over a quarter of them have someone in their family who is gay or lesbian and the like, and they've taken a position disproportionately in favor as opposed to their elder generation on this subject and would support it, and I suppose I would too. It was kind of equivocal. I didn't think it was such a bad thing to say. I think it was, whoa, mercy. Well, I went overseas just the next, I'd come back from Australia. I'd been on a speaking tour. I'd been in town just 5 days. I then flew to a Global Zero meeting, which was even in the interview. So the last part of the story is, she said, well, what are you doing next? And I was later told by my bosses at the NAE, if you would have said, well, I'm going to work on the pro-life issue, you know, hold the line against the liberals, and the rest, that would have been a perfect answer. But instead, I told them I was going to a Global Zero planning meeting in Paris. Paris, I mean, with the French. And Global Zero is this meeting, you see, the foremost meeting where Jimmy Carter and all the leaders of the movement for disarmament met for the first time a year ago. They've just now come out with a movie, Countdown to Zero, and it will go into theaters by Magnolia, which is one of the biggest documentary filmmaker distributors around the country. So it'll go into theaters this fall. But anyway, I said I did that. Well, when I came back, I could tell. I had to fly out to Minnesota to meet with my friend, still is my friend, the president of the NAE, Leith Anderson, who's a pastor of a big church there. And I could tell when I met him at the airport. This is bad. I could tell. It was, well, I'd been getting emails anyway. So I resigned. And I was asked to resign. And it was good. It was the right thing. It was really hard. If you've committed yourself to a ministry for that long, it's really hard to say, I'm giving it up. You ever had that happen to you? Or had somebody say to you, your time is up. We really appreciate everything you've done in the past. Well, maybe they didn't say that. But I knew they really did. And we remained friends, but I was out of there. And so the upshot of all of this is over the last year, I got a phone call first from Tim Worth at the UN Foundation, who I'd worked for as a seminarian. He was a former House member, then became a senator, a global undersecretary of the Clinton administration, and along. He calls me up and he says, we'll give you an honorific role. I said, well, thank you very much. Senior fellow at the UN Foundation, thank you very much, but that doesn't pay my bills. So I said to the Lord, I said, well, I appreciate the folks at the UN, but what about a salary? Well, the next day I got a phone call. And the people at the Open Society, and I have to say this, Paul, because it's on tape, because they asked me to say this. The people at the Open Society Institute in New York City called and said, what are you doing the rest of your life? I said, I want to create the new Evangelical Partnership for the Common Good. And they said, wow, we're interested. I said, you are? They said, we are. So we talked, I competed, they have about 1,000 compete for these fellowships, and I ended up getting one of 3. And we are sort of the truth tellers, each one in religion, one in national security policy, and one in intelligence. And we're the 3 fellows in Washington at the Open Society Institute this year. So they pay my bills. Thank you, George Soros.
All right.
Thank God for a friend of mine who's a pastor and a bishop of Liverpool. When I asked him whether I should do this, he said, one answer. I said, one word. Yes or no? He said, no. I'll give you whether or not you should do this. Join with the liberals like this. And I said, what's the one word? He said, Cyrus. Very good. I like that. So I went ahead. And I have been. And so what I'm doing is creating conversations with evangelicals and others, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that and the climate change issue, and how we intersect with the secular world. And I see your upcoming speakers are going to speak about Islam, and that's very much a part of the report that was released this week called Engaging Religious Communities Abroad, a New Imperative for U.S. Foreign Policy. And so among the other things I've done is to co-chair with Scott Appleby, who is a fundamentalism scholar at Notre Dame. Got a amen. He really is incredible. Scott is that kind of a man. Co-partner with Scott to put together this report on engaging religious communities abroad, a new imperative for U.S. foreign policy. We have 35 scholars who have participated in this. And as a token of my friendship, I'll give one to Kathy and Paul and one to John. So, John, Mark, you have your first copies. And for the rest of you, you can go to the chicagocouncil.org. Now, why this? And why the subject? Okay, I'll back up to say, by way of starting, because it has some relevance to what I want to say further on, the following story, which I have told in meetings outside Rome, Villa Graziola with the Ayatollahs of Iran. And in the course of that, I have met Ahmadinejad. I've told it to the rabbis of Israel. I've told it, I was just speaking at Doshisha University in Tokyo, and so everywhere, everybody gets it. So I'll tell the story. It goes like this. You can insert your own religious faith tradition. In this case, an American evangelical is driving over hill and dale in his Jeep Cherokee, and he jumps out, he walks over to the shepherd who's quietly tending his flock, and he says, "Sir," he says, "if I can tell you how many sheep you have, can I have one?" The shepherd says, "Wow, I guess so." So the American goes back into his truck, gets on GPS, I call it God's Positioning Satellite. I was arguing with mine this morning about getting here. They were saying go one way, I was saying go another. He gets on his GPS and he comes away a few minutes later with a sheet of paper, and he walks back to the shepherd and he says, "You have 1,638 sheep." The shepherd looks at him and says, "That's totally amazing." Well, per the agreement, go pick one out. So he picks one out, this American evangelical does. And he's driving away when the shepherd walks up and pounds on his window and says, "Sir," he says, "if I can tell you what you do for a living, can I have my sheep back?" The American says, "Of course." And the shepherd says, "You are a consultant." The American said, "How did you know?" And the shepherd said, it's simple. You came into my world, which you know nothing about. You answered questions I've never asked. Leave out charged me a lot of money. He says, you don't know diddly squat. He said, you took my sheepdog. You took my sheepdog. Isn't that the way we sort of are? We think we know a whole lot about other cultures and the issues they face and the rest. Well, ostensibly, Paul asked me to speak about post-Copenhagen. So I want to do that. But you have to understand that when I went to Copenhagen, I wasn't going there with the administration appointees who handle climate and other energy issues, right? I was going there separately with a delegation of religious leaders from around the world who had been invited by Women for Peace to do this. And so I was with Muslims from Senegal, Hindus from India and Bangladesh, a few Christians from the West, but mostly the developing world. And there were at least 25 of us, and we spent the week together. And we were downtown Copenhagen. Now, I don't know if you know Copenhagen, but there is Christiana, which is this little enclave in downtown Copenhagen that dates back to the 70s, where you can do anything. You can smoke marijuana. You're in a free zone. And typical of some interfaith gatherings, we had one of our meetings there. Well, if you know American evangelicals, we don't do interfaith. We don't do interfaith. You know, the mainline Protestants have done that for 50 years, and we evangelicals, we don't do this. But see, I believe we should, and we should engage with people of other faiths. And what happened there is something very different than happened, but it was reported in the news. It's what happened there that really so typified why this issue is so important and why Christian people have to engage on it, and it's this. Because the developing world blames us. And particularly as an American evangelical, whether you call yourself one or not, they see the American evangelicals as the problem. And they identify us with the Bush administration's policies of denial. And they say, okay, first of all, you're politically wrong. You've been in the denial stage, and you've not only denied it, but you're refusing to own up to your responsibilities. Second of all, you American evangelicals are, you are the affluent West. That's how they perceive us. And I could go on and on with that stereotype, but the fact of the matter is the American evangelical is very, very different from the evangelical around the rest of the world. I don't need to tell you that. Who is a woman from Nigeria who's a Christian living in a Muslim land who deals with poverty, health issues, health crises, children that face starvation, potentially AIDS, and all the other, if not violence, health issues that accompany living in that kind of a country. That is in the global south, the evangelical in the world today. And yet the stereotype is we who are sitting in this room who are disproportionately white, affluent, and the like. So that's the picture. Now, into that picture, let me say, as an original founder of the Evangelical Climate Initiative, what I believe. And so, while Paul asked me to talk about the politics of Copenhagen, I would like to start out by talking about the physics of Copenhagen. And what are the physics of Copenhagen? Well, let me be blunt. In the U.S., it's largely perceived, this climate issue, as a democratic issue for progressive liberals, and the conservatives, well, they don't consider that part of their responsibility, that is to conserve. And so a lot of conservatives think, well, we'll just keep going on as we have been, squandering what already is, and especially what's most valuable. But that's how it's perceived. Now, I don't understand at all why conservatives have taken that position, but they have. And we know, for example, at the most recent Republican CPAC meetings, one of the proposals you see for being a conservative is that you reject the science of climate change. Wow. And if you want to read the response that Al Gore has to all of this, you can read it in the New York Times this morning. But from my position, and I read Elizabeth Kolbert, who's one of the best scientists on this, and she's been writing on this. She, in a new report released on the eve of Copenhagen, you know, she reflects herself, surprised at how quickly things are changing. Just in the last 2 years, the reports on methane rising are far higher than anyone anticipated. So what is the physics of this? Well, the fact of the matter is, it's my opinion and the opinion of scientists who I count as friends, such as Jim Hansen, who as recently as 2 years ago has been saying we're driving off a cliff. And that's why, in his opinion, and he was very vocal about this at the time, Copenhagen was a disaster. Others like Bill McKibben said the same thing, who is 350.org. You may know him because of his writings. And the reason that they take this position, and I'm very sympathetic to it, although a slight different tack on it, they take the position that the problem here is not Republicans. It's not socialists like Obama, quote-unquote socialists, that's what he accused him, or deficits, or taxes, or misogyny, or racism, or anything else. All the problems that we do face. No, no, no. The adversary here is the physics of climate change. And the physics has an immutable bottom line. And it's what Hansen is saying, and he says, you see, any value for CO2 in the atmosphere greater than 350 parts per million is not compatible, I'm quoting him now, that's Hansen, quote, with the planet on which civilization developed and to which life on Earth is adapted, unquote. And he says that bottom line won't change above 350. That bottom line won't change above 350. And that bottom line is clearly, you see that you will have a melting of the polar ice caps, sea level rise, and hydrological cycles that will throw off a killer for millions, if not billions, as Christian Aid in Great Britain says, by 2050, and so on. And so the physics imposes a bottom line, and it's a time limit. And what it essentially is saying, physics-wise, is that every year we refuse to face up to this problem, it gets much worse, and much worse, to the point that it will become insoluble. And then they say, and I'm sympathetic to what they say, it won't matter then if the United States Congress decides to act, or even for that matter the CCP of China decides to act, because it will be impossible to prevent climate change. It's already unpreventable. The only thing they say that's preventable is the catastrophes that we could prevent, but won't, it seems, because every CO2 movement, parts per million above 390, as the methane, as I said, moves into the atmosphere from the permafrost melt in ways like never before, every 2 degrees centigrade and above per annum that we're moving is going to contribute to these ends. And so they say, we're no longer capable of preventing climate change, only maybe preventing it on such a large scale that takes down all our civilizations. Now, you can say, I don't believe that. And 43%, well, around 40% of evangelicals don't believe that we're doing this. And believe me, around the world, the religious leaders I talk to, they read. They read a lot more about us than we read about them. And so they know exactly what the statistics say on this issue, and they know exactly what American evangelicals, whose views on this are the same as the Republican Party, and they say, you're the problem. And there's certain justification for that. And so, in the big picture, you can't treat this issue like any other political issue, like healthcare, where you can say, okay, let's come together, let's find a consensus, and move together to do something about this. Now, the administration went to Copenhagen with a proposal that would cut greenhouse gas emissions 17% from 2002 levels by 2005 levels by 2020. 17%, which really only translates to a 4% cut from 1990 levels, which is the standard baseline for measurement for most of these countries and the scientists. And so even that was too much, because my own Senator Webb was reported of saying this in the press. He said, I would like to express my concern regarding any report that the administration may believe it has the unilateral power to commit us to politically binding agreements. I mean, that's the United States Senate. And a Senate treaty has to be ratified, and that's our job, not yours. So don't you commit us to that. And so there was no politically binding agreement, legally binding agreement that came out of Copenhagen. And this spring, indeed, even beginning this coming week, the United States Senate, led by 3 senators, will begin this process, and a bill will be put forward, I'm told. And so Lindsey Graham, the Republican, who's dared to disagree with his colleagues, John Kerry, and Joe Lieberman together are putting together a climate energy bill. And we'll see what they come up with, and in all likelihood will include a cap and trade. But back to Copenhagen, the scientists are saying, if you can get the picture, that everything above 390 in Hansen's mind, you know, he's the NASA scientist on this, who's been a thorn in the flesh of politicians for years. What the scientists are saying, including those from Europe and the rest, is that we're headed to an atmosphere that contains 650 parts per million and an ungodly 5 degrees Fahrenheit rise. And everybody's treating this as a problem, like unto healthcare, that you can solve by reaching a consensus here, just like we do on everything else. And unfortunately, that's not true. Because the enemy we face, you see, as I said before, is not Republicans, it's not deficits, it's not taxes, it is the physics of this. Now, evangelicals reason this way. Scientists are evolutionists. I reject evolution, so I'm going to reject what the scientists say. It's an illogical syllogism. But I have been on 40 campuses, and in every place around the United States I've been, I go to churches and meet with evangelicals, and invariably, this is what I hear. I'm not going to believe the scientists. So it doesn't make any difference for them what the scientists say, or for that matter, what Al Gore says. Because they're Democrats, or they're evolutionists, or they are what? But it doesn't make any difference. They're not going to believe that. And so, moreover, you put together these realities, the political realities, even the theological realities of what we're talking about here, and you have a deadly combination. Okay, que pasa? What to do? You know, in light of all of these realities. Now, I happen to think that the gospel speaks to these issues. It is, for me, primarily not a political issue. This is a faith issue. And yet I come out of this tradition that is premillennial dispensational. I don't need to educate you on this. I'm sure you well know. But one of the reasons I went to Denver Seminary is because the emeritus, President Emeritus there, now still alive at 95, Vernon Grounds, was in the 1940s challenging American evangelicalism for its premillennial pessimism, that we don't need to do anything about this. And that reality to the ninth degree still exists, because it doesn't matter where I've been, from the Bible colleges of Lancaster to Portland's Multnomah, or to Abilene, Texas, where Hardin-Simmons University is, or Stetson in DeLand, Florida. It doesn't matter. On every one of the campuses, I ask the students, raise your hand if you've ever had one sermon in your entire life on the subject of creation care. If you've ever even heard of the term, it's the caring for the earth, and there is never a hand. How can this be? Now, there were 2 hands at Lee University. Now, this is 30 miles from where the Scopes trial was held in 1945, and it's Lee University. It's the Church of God. It's an NAE denomination. And there were 2 football players, and I said, now, are you kidding me? They said, we're kidding. But there were 4,500 students in chapel, and I said, now look around you. I want you to look around and tell me if you see any hands. And there were no hands. And I said, what explains this? Okay. Read N.T. Wright. Let me read you one line, which I think more than any other explains what is going on here. what he says, and said in a message I first heard from him in 2005 at Windsor Castle, in the same room where Shakespeare premiered The Merry Wives of Windsor. I heard Tom Wright, arguably the best New Testament theologian in the country. Arguably, I say that jokingly, he is the best. And what Tom says is that we are essentially, he says, Neoplatonists. Now what he says is, in Surprised by Hope, is the following. Plato remains the most influential thinker in the history of the Western world, and for Plato, the present world of space, time, and matter is a world of illusion, of flickering shadows in a cave, and the most appropriate human task is to get in touch with the true reality which is beyond space and time and matter. And for Plato, this is the reality of eternal forms, and that may remind you of your college philosophy class. But believe me, what he goes on to say is that this Neoplatonism combined with Gnosticism, which says, you know, spirit matters, matter doesn't matter, influenced, he says, by some of the unashamed apologists for Gnosticism in the West, from Blake to Goethe to Melville, Yeats, and Jung, among others, as representing this stream in the modern West. And all their insights have been cross-fertilized with other types, he says they can't be ignored. And so you put together that Gnosticism with modern-day Neoplatonism, and he says that we have a soft version of this that's in our heads, all of our heads. And a good many Christian hymns and poems, he says, wander off unthinkingly in the direction of this. The just passing through. Spirituality, as in the spiritual, this world is not my home, I'm just passing through. Though it has some affinities with classical Christianity, it says, encourages precisely this. A Gnostic attitude. The created world is at best irrelevant, at worst dark, evil, gloomy place, and we immortal souls who existed originally in a different sphere, well, we're looking forward to returning to it as soon as we're allowed to do it. And so he says the purpose of being a Christian in America particularly, he says, is to go to heaven when you die. That's the purpose. I said to him, when he first gave this lecture that became part of the book, I said, now, just a second, Dr. Wright, you blame us. Let me tell you, where did John Darby come from? For those of you who know, the leader, intellectual, and otherwise of modern dispensationalists came from Britain. I said, you gave him to us. And he came here. And so that is why, in part theologically, we are where we are today. And it's all in our heads. It's in my head, it's in your head. And we have to get it out. And so I have a 3-part sermon. I did go to a conservative Baptist theological sermon. And so the first is the vision. And you see, it's moving away from a vision, you see, of the future, which says I die, you see, in order to go to heaven, from a mentality that says all of this doesn't matter, to a mentality that says I'm going to have a different world view that says this does matter. And by the way, every usage of heaven and new earth in the New Testament always go together. They're never separated. So I go to a family funeral, and the new man into the family, God help him, there are 4 ministers, says, Richard, I've heard you talk about this, and what do you do with 2 Peter 3 that says it's all going to burn up? I said, well, isn't it possible that it's only going to be refined? And are you basing your entire systematic theology upon the idea that it's all going to be burned up and disappear, and where's the new earth going to come from anyway? Ex nihilo, God's just going to create a new one? He admits, yeah. Wow. And so for him, like unto my brother and half of the family, all of this climate change stuff, no matter what I say, means nothing. And if you think I'm overstating the case, in 2008, Leith Anderson, the president, and I did a poll of the board of the National Association of Evangelicals, over 120 members, and then in spite of the fact that the government affair guy, me, the president, Leith, the executive director, Todd Bassett, former National Commander of the Salvation Army, all stood up and spoke at the National Press Club in behalf of climate change. Half of the board doesn't believe it, that it's a pressing, real issue. And if you look at the most recent data coming out in the last few weeks, that's where a significant percentage of the public is. Only 35% of Americans, according to a Pew poll, think global warming is a very serious problem. And it's a drop of 9 points in 6 months. And if you consider, moreover, the fact that conservatives are obsessed with the so-called climate gate, which from the vantage point of people on the inside is nothing more than a few frustrated careerists who are a bit mean-spirited and willing to simplify or fiddle with their data and call their opponents dangerous idiots. Well, what that is about in the minds of the friends I talk to, well, this is simply welcome to human nature. It does not in any sense dispute the facts or the physics, you see, which is proceeding this way. And I don't believe, given the political realities that we have, which I've discussed, that we're going to try and deal with this in the same way we deal with every other problem, which is find a consensus, move forward, and then leave it to the next guy. That there is any way to change the future apart from changing the religious communities of the world, who will hold their political leaders accountable. Okay, that's the vision. Now, the strategy is as articulated to do this, to work with religious communities. Now, the percentages of the world's religions, that is, lived religion, is going up. By the way, a vision without a strategy is an hallucination. So you can have this vision of addressing this problem and changing the inevitable, but if you don't have a strategy, you're in trouble. And the only strategy I know of that will work either in the United States or around the world is if the religious communities in each of their traditions believe that God challenges them to care for it, whether that religion adheres to a monotheistic God or not. And what is happening, I would like to just summarize in 3 or 4 points, because it's essential to understanding why this document and why the strategy is potentially worthy. And the religious patterns in the volatile world that we live in today, according to the report. Now, this report included the likes of scholars such as, on the left, that would be George Ruff, former president of Columbia University, Harvard Divinity School, International Rescue Committee, and fellow travelers of that sort, Ibu Patel in the Muslim world, a young guy, and conservatives such as Tom Farr at the OIRR Office of International Religious Freedom at the State Department for many years, and Doug Johnson, who's written the famous book, Religion, Missing Dimension of Foreign Policy. So you have the left, the right, the center. Doug is in the center. You have all of these people saying, and these are the trends, that one, the influence of religious groups is growing in many areas of the world and virtually affects all sectors of society, from politics to culture to business and science. That's number one. And the changing patterns in the world are having significant political implications. And that religion has benefited from globalization, but it is also a primary means, that is, religion, of organizing opposition to it, globalization. And it's playing an important role, religion, that is, where governments lack capacity, especially in weak and failed states. We know what they are. And you're going to hear about that from your Islam speaker, I'm sure. But in Pakistan, you see, in Somalia, where you have weak or failed states, religion plays an even more important role in times of economic and political stress, and it's used, point 4, by extremists as a catalyst for conflict and a means of escalating tensions. And lastly, the most important, I think, point to know is that the growing salience of religion today makes religious freedom as a universal human right even more important as a source of social and political stability, if you're following what I'm saying. And bottom line, in terms of what to do about this, the scholars all agree that the United States has a God gap in its foreign policy. And so I've got this for you. You can just circulate it. It was the Washington Post story, The God Gap in U.S. Foreign Policy. So you can just look at it in time to ask questions if you want. But if there is this God gap in American foreign policy that fails to understand these religious trends, and moreover has a secularism that is long-standing, going back 50 years, that fails to appreciate how these religious movements are impacting politics around the world, how can it begin to provide, you see, the basis in foreign policy for the security that we need, for the addressing of the conflicts that we face? It simply can't. And so we propose, and you'll read in the article some of the ideas, including training in ambassadors in ways they've never been trained. Now, my area in the background of education has been China. And so when Jim Sasser, who was appointed to be ambassador to China, was asked in a Senate hearing, confirmation hearing, about the house church, he said, "What is a house church?" And the Foreign Service Institute, which has been designed by a friend of mine, Rabbi Arthur Schneier, the Appeal of Conscience Foundation, to do some of these things, has not really succeeded. And not to Arthur's fault, but rather because, you see, there are biases. And we had a plethora of specialists who came in and gave testimony to this reality, and yet I do believe that the current administration understands this reality, and so what we're saying is that we need to build on the Cairo speech that was given by Obama that says we're going to engage the Muslim world, the religious communities therein, and we're going to do this differently. And so I think we're at a stage internationally, post-Cairo, Ankara, forthcoming speech in Indonesia, in which the current administration understands this problem. Now, the Chicago Council, according to the paper, isn't as influential as the CFR. Well, I know Richard Hawes at the Council on Foreign Relations have a lot of respect for him, but the CFR doesn't have a clue in many respects about what this is about and the role religion is playing in the world. And it so happens that while the Chicago Council is out there in Chicago, and what does anybody in Chicago know? Us East Coasters, that's what we think. New Yorkers especially. It so happens that this is the organization to whom Obama gave his maiden voyage foreign policy speech, and Michelle Obama is on the board of. And we happen to think that, having met with the White House and the State Department this week, they're very receptive to what we're saying. So that is essentially the strategy, to begin to engage on track 2 diplomacy with the religious groups that can begin to put the pressure on China, yes, on India and the others that needs to be put, but particularly here in the United States. And if the conservative evangelicals, who comprise 40% of the broad conservative umbrella, begin to change, whoa, the politicians will listen. And I can only explain it one way, which is to be a little more partisan than I would like to be, but what is happening is that in the last election, 2008, the percentages of evangelicals that voted for the Republican standard bearer dropped 9% in North Carolina and 6% Ohio, and that was replicated all around the country, especially in the swing states. And so what was happening is that you had 43% of the public in North Carolina saying they're evangelicals, 30% in Ohio, and they're saying, we're not going to accept this. Now that may have just been 2008, and that may change back. But what won't change is that you have a younger guard of evangelicals who are absolutely persuaded by exit polls that in their top tier issues include not just poverty and conflict and war, but also climate change. And they specifically identify it. And having been around the country, and in spite of a heritage that teaches them to be Neoplatonists, they're saying we care about this earth and we're going to change it, and we're not going to allow our politicians to behave with business as usual. Now that's the strategy. Now Sun Tzu, he said, many centuries ago, he said, okay, you can have a strategy without tactics, and that's the slow road to victory. But if you have tactics without a strategy, he says that's the noise before, sound of the noise before defeat. So the point is, you have to have a vision of where you want to go. You have to have a strategy that works, and you have to have tactics. And what I say to people is that you have to move them. It may be your roommate, it may be your parents, but in a transactional analysis of psychology, Kathy can tell me if this is true or not, you have to move people on a continuum. And so the tactic is to do that. It's to move people from deny, I won't change, to deliberate, I may change, to design, I will change, to doing, I am changing, and defending, I have changed, and I'm going to persuade others to do this, and there is no done. But my favorite writer on the subject is Bob Dottelt at the University of Oregon, who's written this book called The Power of Sustainable Thinking. Now, he's not a believer, but he says you need people who will challenge others and just be the disturbers. Because he said 80% of most people, especially when you're talking about a paradigm shift of thinking, it doesn't matter whether you're talking about climate change and evangelicals and how they think about science, or about this subject of the role of religion in the world today. He said, you have to have people who will be disturbers. And that's because, he said, in order to get somebody to change their mind, there has to be a disturbance that comes into their life that shifts them, you see, from the status quo to think about their highest aspirations and how they would really like to live. And it's only when there's a disturbance that they will begin to reflect and think and move from to deny to deliberate. Well, maybe I do need to change my life. And it's characteristic of the ACOAs and everybody else. AA, right? You have to have somebody who will say, I'm not happy with the status quo and I'm willing to change. So that's the tactic. And it's 10:15. So I want to stop. I talked long enough. So I'm willing to that. I'm willing to do that.
My name is Howard.
Yes.
I was the first energy use analyst in the CIA.
Yes.
In the 70s. This is all wonderful, stirring stuff, but you're not following through yet on your own assumptions.
Fair enough.
I think the next thing that is needed is small groups involved in this. A great example. You mentioned the airplane. That was the kids and the wife of a fisherman, and there were only 3 of them. They, 3 of them, did everything that was needed that today would take 20,000 guys in a major corporation to bring about. They're Christians. What I find missing, and your rhetoric so far, and I know you're sincere, I think you're a good man.
Thank you very much.
But what's missing?
Yes, what's missing, yes. From what I've said, at least.
Yes, yes. The next step is, I don't think there's much hope in Capitol Hill and bed groups. A lot of upper middle class people getting together in a big room. It ain't gonna work.
Right.
What works is small people. For example, what's happening in this failing Pakistan and India next door is these women being given $40 a year to start sewing. And what's coming out of that, they're making money, it's capitalism is occurring, it works. And
Yes.
it's the micro.
Yes, absolutely.
It's the micro stuff.
Yes.
But see, I didn't.
Well, I believe that. For example, my experience is in the Atlas Mountains of Morocco, and we're taking our show on the road to Morocco with its Muslim leaders here in April for the first Earth Day in a Muslim country. But in the mountains of the Atlas area of Morocco, the young women are getting together and they're learning how to use 1950s America's Singer sewing machines. And you just cry. Because what they really need is a laptop. And they need something other than a Singer sewing machine. But that's been the best they've been given. But you're exactly right.
Well, what the Atlas is the dividing line of Morocco between the eastern coast where there's rain.
Yeah.
And you cross that line and you're in desert.
Yeah.
And that's the defining part of that part of the world.
Yeah.
And the French carried about that, and they put divisions of French Norwegian people who built the roads
Well,
across.
But we're going to have to address these issues of the rising power of religious voices and actors and the role of women. And if we don't do those things, we're going to face the consequences.
To the list I would add.
And the test case is Afghanistan and Pakistan. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes.
Right now.
But I'd say add technicians and called by God engineers, and we do not produce engineers anymore in this country. Who are the engineers here? Chinese people come in, blacks, anybody else, Chinese, Indonesian, we've lost that. I grew up with engineers in Connecticut going back. You know, my people got to Boston in 1635, and they worked, and they were engineers, and they know about seabed. You go back in American history, you look at the settlement line of New England in 1700, when the Europeans have been aboard, 2 generations, 70 years. It's 5 miles or 10 miles from the coast. If you get this in Winthrop at the very beginning, nobody wants to go into the wilderness. It's full of wild men, and behind them is crouching the effigy of Satan, and it pulls them back. And then they find out, well, they knew about fish. That's what saved them. And I'd say there's 2 things you need. You need your vision, but you need some kind of crazy mechanic who's going to make the machines and produce the technology. And there needs to be 2 kinds of ideas. The kind of vision you have politically.
Yeah.
But I would not look to Capitol Hill. I worked there. I have no hope for Capitol Hill ever getting anywhere. But you do need microcosms in the towns and the villages everywhere, where everything comes from anyway. Why does slavery spring into power in the 19th century? And the South is getting rid of it.
Yeah,
Eli Whitney, a good Connecticut Yankee, invents the cotton gin.
yeah, and we need those kinds of inventors today in those countries who will apply these truths in order to change what will inevitably be otherwise a civilizational conflict of the worst order that we'll spend 100 years dealing with, as Huntington said. But I happen to believe blatant, you see, even within American evangelicalism, because I said to Professor Huntington once, I said, "You don't understand evangelicalism." He said, "You're right, I don't." I said, "What you don't understand is that you can meet with a man who spent 40 years in a prison in China, who will say, 'I don't hate my captors. I love them.' And that is a different ethic that will prevent, I think, the kind of civilizational conflict he sees for 100 years. But you can talk about that next week. Paul.
Well, yes, you know, the evangelicals over the past 50 years have wrestled with this issue of creation evolution in science a lot. And I think some are beginning to come to terms with it. You're beginning to see a lot of books coming out that are building a bridge between these 2 views. And people like Francis Collins,
Yes.
head of NIH, is an evangelical who is completely in line with evolution. But on the other side, that's Genesis. That's that's the past, the history. I have not seen anywhere near that much wrestling with eschatology on the other end, the future, and sorting out. You mentioned 2 Peter. That's an example. Do you know of any sources or any guidance on people who have worked on eschatology?
Well, a group of us met in the last year to design a path for the academic scholarship that will address the eschatology questions, to begin to shift this boat, this huge boat of American evangelicals. Now, the good news
Most people
is,
have read Tim LaHaye, you know, the Left Behind series.
yeah,
It's
when
so
you have
popular,
40 million plus sales of Left Behind, and 100 million annually into the coffers of LaHaye and Jenkins from a series of this sort, you can't help but realize how deep is this. Now, there is a debate. Some say, well, it's like reading a John Grisham novel. No effect. You know, that's what my friends who are willing to tolerate that kind of view say. No effect. Leith, my friend Leith, and he says, they read it like I read a novel. I say, it's worse than that. My friend Tom Sine says, yeah, it's really worse than that. Mustard Seed Conspiracy and other books, who says they ingrain those values and they spend the rest of their lives living by them. So you're exactly right. The eschatology question has to be addressed, and it has to seep down from the seminaries to the, you know, into the pew. And that's a huge difference. Is that right, John? Will it happen? The eschatology change? I don't know.
You don't know how far away it is.
What?
You don't know how far away it is. Bertrand Russell said, in the long run, and I did have one conversation with this, in the long run, everybody's dead. And, okay, that's a grim kind of secular approach. But the problem is going to be coming a lot sooner than the eschaton. We don't know when the eschaton is coming.
The earth will go on. The question is, what about us? Marge or Kathy or...
Well,
yes?
you said that, you know, with the voting change, that there's a shift, a movement among evangelicals to take this seriously, but then you said these young evangelicals in these colleges don't have a clue.
No, I'm saying
So
that they have
don't
been
see-
raised without a clue,
Yeah, but
they are shifting.
Are they?
Yes.
So even though they hadn't heard a sermon on the topic, they themselves
Yes.
were persuaded by
Yes.
the evidence. Okay.
They're persuaded themselves.
Okay.
And they are making the shift,
Okay.
often without too much help.
Right.
I've been on on campuses where the political science professors say that climate change is all a hoax, just like Jim Inhofe on Capitol Hill, and yet they have 300, 400, 500 kids who are all culture majors who are studying the language, the political science, the culture of going to North Africa or wherever. And so they go overseas and they come back and they're changed, and they say to their professors, "I'm sorry, but you don't know what you're talking about."
So they're challenging.
Yeah, they're challenging the status quo
On climate change and other social issues.
on a host of issues, absolutely. And the question is, how soon will that have an impact? The only thing politicians understand is if you're able to go into their district and boot them out. And so Ron Wyden's staff looks across the border and looks at Boise and say, "I have no idea how that happened, that you have a Democrat in Boise, and I can tell you why it happened. It happened because you have big churches, evangelical churches in downtown Boise, where the pastor, among others, is preaching creation care, and the kids in the church, been there, are saying, you know, what does it mean when the member of Congress says to me that you can get oil out of a tree?" And the Rotary Club people say, "This is craziness." And so they vote him out. And so the first time they have a Democrat in downtown Boise. And they don't understand this. This isn't supposed to happen in Boise, you know. Conservative Idaho. And it can happen in any district. And so some politicians will only pay sense if you can, in effect, show them that they face a bleak future as a politician if they don't change. Yes, Marge, you were hand up, and then
I feel like this week I've been thrown into the deep end of the ocean because in the past week I've read The Language of God by Francis Collins, and I've heard him speak. And it's about evolution, and it's a book that I never really addressed it because, frankly, it scares me theologically a little bit, but also it scared me scientifically. I'm a liberal arts person, and all that stuff is hard to understand. The Language of God by Francis Collins is understandable to the likes of me. It was a wake-up call to me that and climate change is also an area that's a little scary theologically, but it's also scary scientifically because it talks about a lot of things I don't understand. And so one question I have is there a good starting point that liberal arts, non-science people can read and really get the drift of? You've done a great job today. Is there some kind of a book that would give a little more depth to
the theological and the scientific?
mostly
Both?
the scientific?
Mostly the
actually,
scientific.
Yeah, I mean, to really explain that. The second, I just want to also say that last night I heard John Perkins. John Perkins, I think you all know from Mendenhall, was just preaching prophetically, and he said, and he may have been exaggerating a little bit, but he said, you know what, the race issue in the young people today, that is no longer an issue. Young people in college, university, post-college, they're not thinking about race anymore. He said it's wonderful. But he said they have other big issues on their minds, and what is going to kill our country is this opposition, this hatred between the left and the right, the liberal and the conservative. It is not just the difference of opinion, it is a disrespect, a hate, and a refusal to listen.
Yeah.
So all of this together said to me, I need to learn more. I need to listen more. I need to be willing to to talk to people who I might think I disagree with.
Yes.
If we
Yeah.
don't do that, if we don't get small groups to do this, if we don't try to listen to each other, and we have a big
Yeah,
problem.
we have a big problem. And Francis Collins says both positions, the idea that science doesn't need faith or faith doesn't need science, both are wrong.
Yep,
Both are detrimental to the higher aspirations of
Yeah.
mankind.
yeah.
Both will lead to destruction. Both of these ends, these bookends, whether it's Richard Dawkins or whoever you want to talk
Right.
about on the one hand.
Yeah.
And Collins is exactly right about what philosophy we need to have.
There is
So
a,
what's
Yeah.
both, what, do you have a?
But do you have a book that's sort of a, language of God for,
Not
The whole
everyone
question
bridges the two. It's interesting.
Yeah.
Question presupposes a problem that's existed and reflect even in the literature. You have Christians who write who write books that I think are pretty clear about what's happening on the subject. A friend of mine, an evangelical head of the National Wildlife Federation, has written a book, The Last Chance, and this is about climate change and its impacts, particularly here in America. Larry Schweiger. But it's not a theological treatise, it's more of a scientific presentation.
so there's not a
But
conflict.
I personally, well, I personally think if you want to know how to move people to think differently, read Doppel. If you want to read the science, read Elizabeth Kolbert. She's one of the best. I know that I could email you a list of a variety of different books. There
But
are a
there
lot out
isn't
there.
one that addresses it like you
there's
have
something
with
that's
us
easier
today.
to do,
Yes.
and that is the Sustainability Institute at MIT has a website up with a simulator on it that graphically shows what's happening with the parts per million and what has to happen in order to reach a level of stability. So it's John Sturman, have you heard of him?
Yes.
He's been working with John Kerry on climate change.
Yes.
But the website is a very clear way to, and it's a very simple simulator, and it gives you a very clear way to look at the issue of what's happening.
The conflicts are not irreconcilable if you consider the fact that if you don't expect the West to deny its growth, and the East is able to change itself to be more efficient, these crossing paths can do so in a way before catastrophe occurs. But that depends on action by both sides. Yes, sir.
You made a passing reference to human nature as being part of the problem with some of the scientists in the environmental movement. And I'd like to put human nature as being one of the issues that you, your vision, and your strategy and practice are wrestling with, in the sense that we are all, I would say, by nature, myopic. We see today, 2020 is a long way away.
Yes.
2050 is even further. That's one element that it seems to me we are wrestling with,
Yes.
you are wrestling with, we are wrestling with. The other is continuity. We each expect, our expectations are built on that tomorrow will be the same as today, and today, and today, and today. And what you're talking about in terms of these ceilings is unnatural. That is, say, 350, why is that a threshold? I don't see that 351 is different from 349. And when anybody tells me that there is a discontinuity that is going to occur and we will go beyond our ability to cope, that is an unnatural phenomenon that you are asking me to accept.
Yes, that's right. And in effect, what we're asking people to do, according to Bob Doppel, is to move from straight line thinking to systems-based thinking. And straight line thinking says that A produces A plus B plus C equals D, and doesn't include the prospect for the impossible to happen, such as the alteration of the Gulf Stream. But you see, systems-based thinking says the impossible can happen, and we need to move from short-term to long-term. You see, from the idea that technology can save us to the idea that we need small, flexible units. We need to move from, this is how I say it to kids, young college says, it's moving from take, make, and waste. Take from the earth, make things, and put the waste back into the earth, to borrow, use, and replenish or return. Borrow from the earth, use, and replenish. And that's a wholesale shift in the way of living. But you're exactly right. You're asking people to believe something. But see, what is happening is that the impossible does happen. The Katrinas occur. And if you put into this whole subject the questions of nuclear technology and weaponry and failed and weak
But
states,
it's not what can happen. We can all believe that lots of things can
but
happen.
that it will.
But that it will happen
Yeah.
is a whole different dimension.
Yes.
So it's a different kind of an
You're
argument.
exactly right. It's hard. It's hard for us to believe
very
that.
quickly,
Yes.
this notion of the inevitability of a change that forces us to spend 5–10% of our GDP today in order to prevent or at least try to mitigate the likelihood, possibility of future devastation is a big, big ask.
Now, they would say, the Hansons and others who've looked at this, Al Gore has a piece in today's New York Times, they say it's a 2% GDP now, that will save 20 to 30% of GDP by 2050. So should we invest it now? Answer, yes. But do people want to do that? No.
You know, Richard, I was thinking of a little illustration about this question that Marge asked about, you know, what system thinking and, you know, the nonlinear processes, and trying to figure out how to make an illustration of that. One example is a pile of sand. You know, you can add one grain at a time, and it keeps on piling up, and then once in a while, when you drop a grain on it, all of a sudden there's kind of a landslide, and a whole lot of sand grains all fall all at once. And all it took was one tiny grain of sand, you know. And that brings me to another illustration that to bring this back home as a kind of a little moral lesson. I'm going to just illustrate it this way. See this? The pitcher of ice water. Every Sunday before our class, the help comes and brings about 4 or 5 pitchers full of ice cubes. Every Sunday. Summer, winter, whatever. And this process has been going on, and our staff, Diana, has been heroically trying to stop this process. We do not need the ice cubes, right? Ice makers take a lot of energy. We have $211,000 utility bill in the budget, right? We're trying to cut back on use right here. So I'm saying, this is the grain of sand. This is where it starts. Right at home, right here in our church. This church was built in 1967, when oil was cheap as water, you know? We don't have one double-glazed window in the entire church, okay? We haven't done anything about this. Hopefully, we're going to have an energy discussion meeting. I've been trying to get some interest in this. But the point is, forget about the global thing and start locally. Start with your home, with your church. Let's start working on these things and get conscious of our energy footprint everywhere. You know, that's my message.
Yes.
To keep it simple. But you've been very inspiring, Richard, and I thank you very much.
One last quote. John Wesley, to serve the present age, my calling to fulfill, O may it all my powers engage, to do my master's will. Arm me with jealous care, as in thy sight to live, and O thy servant prepare a strict account to give.
Could you close us in prayer?
Yes. We do pray, acknowledging our Heavenly Father, your sovereign lordship over us, your people, and pray you would give us your mind, the mind of Christ, in all of these matters. We pray for the small groups that we are part of, that we may see a vision for how we might use them that we're already part of to help change the world for you in every way, witnessing through our words and our lives of our faith in you. And may we be a powerful witness as we move forward in his Jesus' precious name. Amen. Thank you for the opportunity.
It's on sustainability.